So it's always exciting to me to follow up on a bunch of talks and see that what we're doing is, thank you, fits into the big picture in a very unique way and is addressing questions that people have been raising. I am Lynn Paul. I work at CalTech, which is known much more so for space exploration and other things, not so much for human studies. And I work very closely with Warren Brown, who's at Fuller Seminary Travis Research Institute a couple miles away. Monica came to us several years ago and said, we need to understand long-term outcomes in these conditions. So our questions are this. You can go on. Essentially, what is possible? Not looking at predictive, but what is the optimal, what could happen? What's the best case scenario, or the best case scenarios? You can load it. Are there characteristic profiles? Is there a pattern of any sort that is informative, that could help guide people in developing interventions? What are the limits of compensation? How far can you compensate, and where do things really become a challenge? How does this impact daily functioning in adults, real life? And then how does the remaining hemisphere, does it retain its typical patterns of connectivity? Does it function the way it did before? And if it doesn't, how is it different? So our work, go on, is focused on adults and high-functioning adults, because we're looking at what's optimal, the best case scenario. What does that look like? And we're looking at 3 different domains. I'm going to try to touch on each of these quickly. We have cognitive abilities and psychosocial abilities that we're doing primarily in Warren's lab. That's an in-lab assessment. We're looking at everyday functioning and then functional reorganization of the cortex. So our in-lab participants, so far we've tested 8 subjects. They're coming from multiple countries, mainly the United States, but some outside. Part of why I wanted to put this up after hearing all of this discussion today is these are all, as you'll see in a minute, high functioning. They are AA degrees. One has a master's degree. Most of them have some college. I think at least one of those now has an AA. And onset, birth, 11 years, 3 years. Age at hemispherectomy, 3 months, 20 years. The range and the variation in this population was not a simple slam dunk that either, we were getting the high functioning ones and they were all young at surgery or they were all old at surgery or something. And the range of diagnoses is as you would expect, probably. None of them are having ongoing seizures, one possibly, but, and they were all in their 20s to 30s at the time of testing. Okay. So very briefly, for those of you who care about this detail, this is our neuropsych battery. We're doing a totally comprehensive neuropsychological assessment, and part of that is because our interest in hemispherectomy in part came from our work looking at callosal agenesis. And so one of the theories is if your hemispheres are disconnected from birth, you're kind of working without the hemispheres working together, or you're kind of working with one hemisphere at a time. So how do they compare to somebody who only has one hemisphere? So we have this test battery done in a large sample of adults with agenesis, and that is one of our comparison groups. Next slide. We also are doing a whole bunch of tests looking at higher functioning social skills, because what we have found in callosal agenesis is that the limits of compensation are on complex, novel tasks. And what is more complex and novel throughout life than social interaction? You can only do so much routine and be successful socially. So this is all, I'm only going to present a couple little details of our cognitive data. We're very early on in analyzing all this, but I wanted to show you the distribution. The individuals in yellow are the left hemispherectomy subjects. The others are right. The normal range would be, I had a box in here, but right around here, so about 85 to 115. So all of these individuals are falling in that generally normal range. Now granted, we selected them for full-scale IQ of about 80 or above. But what's interesting is the pattern. So these are subscales of the IQ test. This is verbal comprehension, performance, which is more spatial skills, working memory, again, and processing speed. And I didn't do statistics on this, it's such a small sample, but you can see that in our group, verbal skills are strong. And the others are a bit weaker. In fact, all of the participants had well over 1 standard deviation difference between their verbal comprehension and processing speed. Some of them up to 3 standard deviations difference. That's huge. If your verbal abilities, your vocabulary, your fund of knowledge, your comprehension is 3 times better than your processing speed, how frustrated are you all the time, right, as an adult? And how confusing is it for everybody else who says, well, you sound fine and you seem fine, but you miss things and you have these weird memories and you put things together in weird ways. Well, if you only get every 3rd sentence and you miss what's going on because your processing speed is so slow, it has a huge impact. And it can look like a memory impairment when it's really a processing speed impairment. We also found that for the majority of them, their verbal was better than their processing speed. This could be an artifact of the fact that we're looking for the high-functioning individuals, and in our society, if you have good verbal skills, you can handle a lot, and you can do well. And then also, working memory tended to be a bit better than processing speed. So the ability to hold information in your head and use it is one thing. The ability to do it under time pressure is another. Next slide. In academic achievement, these are adults. So we looked at reading tests, word reading, comprehension, and phonemics. I expected what we've seen in our agenesis subjects is that something simple like word reading can be practiced, can be rote, tends to be better than comprehension. There really wasn't a clear pattern. So by adulthood, we were not seeing a clear pattern of differences across these skills. Even phonetics was similar to the other reading skills. One place that we did see a difference is that in at least 2 of the right hemispherectomy subjects, rote calculation, was significantly better than applied math. But it was only in those 2. And the same thing here with writing. Spelling, we typically find in our agenesis patients, it can be practiced, it's easier, it tends to be better than writing. We didn't find that here. So I'm not sure how this will go over time, but I'm guessing it's very different than what you're seeing in elementary school. And things are somehow evening out, or those who do well are those who are able to master across domains. Okay? For our tests of everyday functioning, and I'm sorry we don't have all the rest. We've got memory tests, we've got all sorts of things, so come back, we'll keep putting things out. This is a larger cohort. 6 of the subjects are from the in-lab study. But again, I wanted to point out that these are individuals who could do an online questionnaire, multiple online questionnaires about their daily functioning. They had to have an IQ of above 80. And we've got a range of diagnoses. We have both left and right hemispherectomy. The IQ range tops out at about average Nobody goes much above average range. And it's a distribution of genders across. So some of the things you might think of to predict, and if I looked at age of surgery, again, that's not going to be predictive. Okay, next slide. So what we did was we did this adaptive behavior questionnaire, and we gave it to the people themselves, the people with hemispherectomy, and to an observer. And the self-ratings were interesting. They rated social skills and practical skills as normal. And actually, on average, the group rated themselves as better than average on conceptual skills. Oh, sorry, yeah. So self-direction, conceptualization, communication, these are people that have advocated for themselves. And they know it, and they've worked hard at it. Next. But when you look at the observer report, compared to the norms, the observers rated these individuals, same individuals, as significantly worse than expected for their age on practical skills, self-care, home living, because they tend to be more dependent on others and use more resources, and didn't rate them as any different from norms on these other domains. When you directly compare self versus the self-report versus observer, next slide. What we found was, going along with your comment about metacognition and the lack of awareness, if we presume that observers are perhaps more accurate in their assessment of how these individuals are doing, have a broader range of comparison, they rated the individuals with hemispherectomy as worse than the self-reports in the conceptual domain, in the practical domain, and in the social domain. So it suggests that the adults with hemispherectomy are underestimating their challenges compared to what observers see as their challenges, which would be a metacognition self-awareness concern. Next. And another interesting feature of this was, oh, back one. Back. We were curious about how that might relate to IQ. And what we found was, so this is the informant report and self-report. So the self-report, the scores are global. This is a global adaptive functioning scale or score. As the IQs got higher, they rated themselves as better in global adaptive functioning. And as the IQs got higher, the observers did that, rated them better as well. Not surprising. What's interesting is as they got higher IQ, they got closer to matching the observer. So whatever goes into that full-scale IQ, which is presumably a lot of verbal skills, is helping them improve that metacognitive ability and take in information and learn and observe themselves. We'll see if this holds up over larger samples. Next. And then our last little tidbit here. This is the same sample that I showed you earlier. These two are blocked out because we don't have their data in this analysis. Next. Next slide. So these are the 6 subjects in this study. Next. And what we were doing was looking at resting state MRI using the HCP protocol for recording resting state. So this is how your brain is activated when you're just there, not thinking about anything particular, not doing any task. And there's a known set of networks that come out when you look at large groups of typical controls, that these areas, these networks, are more closely coupled and working together than they are with other networks. Does that make sense? I didn't explain that well. So one of our questions was, if we look at one hemisphere in a control and compare it to one hemisphere in a hemispherectomy subject, is the organization of those basic resting networks the same? or has it fundamentally changed in some large way? And so we looked at the similarity of activation of all the voxels within one of these areas, one of these little regions, one of these 200 regions, the similarity of the activation of a voxel to all of the other voxels in that area, or the parcels, sorry, that was the first one. The second is one parcel to all the other parts of the network, and then one network to the outside. And you would expect that within network, things are more similar in their activation. Outside of network, these are different networks, they're not as similar. And that is exactly what you find in controls. We have a really large control group, a smaller control group, a matched control group, and then our hemispherectomy subjects are the HS. And they are following the pattern very clearly. They appear to have the same networks and have a similar kind of organization. Next. The next question was, how reliable is that pattern of functional connectivity over time? So if you test them one day and you test them another day, can you recognize the brain from its pattern of connectivity? So it's kind of a fingerprint of brain activation approach. And these are matched controls, and it's right hemisphere and left hemisphere of each control. And these dots are how well one time point predicted another versus an array of, a distribution of, I don't know how to say this, sorry. We'll leave it at that. It's their ability to predict. And what you're seeing is this dot shows that my time point, oh, these are predictions of the other subjects, sorry. So I predict, my brain activation predicts me at time 2 better than it predicts you at any point, right? And the same is coming through on our hemispherectomy subjects. So there's consistency in the pattern of their neural networks. Next. So then, this is where it gets a little interesting. We wanted to look at the functional connectivity within a network and the degree of functional connectivity, comparing the controls and the hemispherectomy subjects, and compare that to the functional connectivity within or between networks in the controls and in the hemispherectomy subjects. And what we found is that within a network, the red are the hemispherectomy subjects. They're pretty broadly distributed over the range of the controls. So their functional connectivity within network was typical. Look at this little box here. That's a large 1,400 sample distribution of between network functional connectivity. And all our red dots tend to be above that. There was more between network functional connectivity in the hemispherectomy subjects than in typical subjects. Does that make sense? So the networks are working together, and I won't go into the rest of this because of time, but we can go on to the next one. What it looks like, and this is preliminary, it's a small sample, but there's relatively greater between network connectivity in that residual hemisphere than you would expect. And we just started looking at how that correlates with cognitive performance. And those individuals who had even the higher your between level connectivity, the greater that was, it was negatively associated with cognitive performance. So it's not that pulling in those extra resources was actually being very beneficial. It may have been beneficial, but it wasn't sufficient to improve performance. We don't know. But it does suggest that the brain is compensating by recruiting other areas to collaborate, which we would expect, but is the first time we've been able to see this. So we'll continue to look at this. There are many more analyses to be done. But our hope is to describe more broadly the range of what's possible and identify some patterns. And something that we have found in our other work is that when you identify something like processing speed as a problem, and you're able to tell children and teachers that this is a fundamental issue, that informs how you handle all of these other interventions, reading, memory, etc. And it also helps the child with their frustration and may end up improving performance, long-term outcome, because you have an idea of what the fundamental issue is, and you're not getting hooked into each domain as being its own fundamental problem. My last comment is, it was fascinating to me, I didn't emphasize this earlier, there was not a difference in this high-functioning cohort between right and left hemispherectomy. There was just not a clear, and as we go through the rest of the data, language skills were good in both groups, phonetic reading was good in both groups. So what that tells us is yet to be discerned. Many questions. Thank you.